What if the Nazis had won World War II? Well, buckle up, because this isn't some campy B-movie. It's scarier than you think. That 250,000 Axis troops were trapped in the desert, forcing them to retreat all the way back to Germany. And then 6 months later, the tide turned again when the Allies landed in Normandy. But what if those battles had gone the other way? What if there had been fewer Allied troops in Normandy? What if the Red Army hadn't stopped the Germans? And what if the Japanese had held off the Allies in the Pacific? What if, as some historians argue, Hitler had simply delayed the Russian invasion? But while the attack is a surprise, it doesn't change much. The US is already rearming the Brits. Either way, the United States enters the conflict in late 1943. But now they have to face a powerful enemy with advanced weapons and fortified positions. Remember that section of the video where we saw those Nazi scientists examining the mysterious device? What if the same team of engineers had devoted their talents to developing Nazi tanks instead of the atomic bomb? Well, that world is more likely. The economic collapse of Nazi Germany is one of the most debated topics in alternate history. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from the past is that tyranny only survives with our consent. And now it's time to hear from you. Do you think the Nazis could have won World War II? Why or why not? Sound off in the comments below. Historians Richard Overy and John Erickson both agreed that if Hitler had invaded Russia later, the Nazi economy would have collapsed by 1960 anyway. We do know that every book, movie, and video that explores this scenario poses an important question. How fragile is freedom? Take, for example, the popular series, The Man in the High Castle. Imagine a world where the Nazis won World War II. Well, that alternate reality is actually less fictional than you might think. According to declassified documents from the CIA, America could have looked very different had the Nazis won. Some historians believe that America would have been split in half, with the Nazis controlling the eastern states and the Japanese ruling the west. Others believe that the US would have been spared, but under heavy occupation until the end of the conflict. Either way, the CIA believed that a post-war America could have been unstable and prone to unrest. As the Americans struggled to cope with the consequences of defeat, rebel groups would have formed across the country. Some would fight back against the occupying forces, while others would promote a vision of a peaceful and prosperous future under the Nazi regime. And in the end, it would have been up to the people of America to decide which path their country would take. Why? Because Germany didn't have enough oil to keep the war machine running. Well, I hope you enjoyed this alternate history adventure. And while you're at it, be sure to check out my video on what would have happened if Hitler had gotten the atomic bomb. What if Hitler won the space race? And don't forget to subscribe for more updates. Sure, the Soviets had plenty, but with Germany's unreliable allies like Japan and Romania, resource shortages would have eventually ground the Nazi war machine to a halt. Plus, according to Polish historian Jan T. Gross, the sheer brutality of the Greater German Reich would have bred resentment and resistance movements across Europe, which could have ultimately destabilized the entire continent. American paratroopers land in southern France and race toward Paris, but they're wiped out by German snipers and tanks. Well, according to declassified documents from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the truth was somewhere in between. His drug addiction was out of control, and he was increasingly paranoid about a military coup. In this alternate timeline, Hitler's inner circle grew even more brutal as ambitious officers like Himmler and Göring fought each other to take power. Eventually, it would have come to a head, and according to declassified documents from the Office of Strategic Services, this would have caused a civil war in Germany and possibly across Europe. The Nazi war machine produced many futuristic-looking vehicles like the Wehrmacht V1 rocket-propelled aircraft, which may have even seen some combat during the Battle of Britain. But according to expert analysis, these vehicles were often little more than oversized heaps of junk. Meanwhile, the Red Army fights to the death against the Germans. But as the casualties mount, Soviet leadership begins to consider ending the war. Stalin reaches out to the Americans through diplomatic channels and negotiates peace terms. Under the Treaty of Moscow, the Red Army withdraws, giving Germany control of Eastern European nations and vast quantities of Soviet oil and grain. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but Stalin needs the breathing room to rebuild and launch the communist revolution elsewhere. For now, the Western allies are demoralized and exhausted after fighting a costly defensive war. They struggle to match German innovation and training. And besides, Italy's already fallen. There's nothing left to fight for. By 1947, the British surrender and the Americans pull out of occupied zones. Now it's just a matter of time before the rest of the Western nations fall. In this nightmare world, the swastika flies over the White House, and the German eagle soars over New York City. American public opinion was against entering the war, and with their neutrality threatened, FDR seizes the opportunity to finally shift the American people towards intervention. So the German-Japanese alliance has 2 years head start. What happens next depends on this question. Does Nazi Germany develop the atomic bomb? According to declassified files from the Manhattan Project, they were extremely close. In fact, you've probably heard this clip before. It's from the film Oppenheimer. It shows J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, nervously walking through a Berlin street as the Nazis goose-step around him. Well, that's based on this, a top-secret memo written just after the war. It reveals that Nazi Germany had developed their own version of the little boy bomb design. This alternate timeline we get a glimpse of that world. Cut to black and white footage of Berlin. Anxious faces peer out from behind window blinds as American soldiers patrol the streets. We see piles of destroyed Nazi equipment, including this strange device with an antenna. It turns out to be a massive radio transmitter capable of amplifying signals across continents. Could this have been used to amplify invisible beams of energy to ignite uranium? Because if he did, things could have played out very differently. We all know that the Allied victory at El Alamein in October 1942 marked a turning point in the war. June 1941, Hitler makes one critical change. He delays the invasion of Russia just a year. When I first heard this theory, I thought it was crazy. The Russian winter alone will destroy the German army. France falls. Britain surrenders. Without Soviet interference, he turns his attention to North Africa. Rommel's Afrika Korps crushes the British and races into Egypt. By December 1941, the Germans control the Suez Canal. Oil pumping operations begin immediately. Soon after, Cairo falls, too. The Egyptian campaign may have been trickier without Operation Barbarossa to distract the Germans, but with Britain cut off from India and its colonial troops, there was no outside help. But according to Oxford historian Richard Overy, it was actually a lot closer than you might think. What do you think? Is this plausible? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'll be checking them throughout the week. With Britain on the brink of surrender and America still neutral, the Axis powers turned the tide. By 1947, the swastika flies over Washington. This was almost our reality. And now, thanks to recent declassified documents, we can find out exactly how close Hitler came to winning it all. So let's play out the worst-case scenario. First, we need to ask, how could this have happened? Let's start with an animated map. Here's how it goes down. In 1940, Hitler completes the conquest of Europe. At the same time, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the conflict. If the Nazis had beaten the Allies to the bomb, they may have deployed it in the final battle against the Soviets, breaking the stalemate on the Eastern Front. But even if the Nazis had won, their dominance wouldn't last forever. But what about the famous Nazi UFO footage? Were the Germans really building flying saucers, or was it just more Nazi propaganda? In any case, by the mid-1940s, Hitler's health was seriously so we may never know if Hitler would have won the war. But we do know that even if he had, his empire would have eventually collapsed. Well, we may never know what would have happened if Hitler had invaded Russia a year later. So what would you have done if the Nazis had won World War II?